Over the next few months, Battlefield 1942 is going to be mentioned an awful lot. After all, we are heading back to World War II with the next Battlefield game, and so there is obviously going to be a lot of crossover at some point. Now, Battlefield 1942 had an expansion that released in 2003 called Secret Weapons of World War II. And at the BF5 reveal event, Daniel Berlin announced that Secret Weapons will be returning for Battlefield 5. Check this out.
You will get to fly iconic airplanes, engage in incredible tank battles, and also unleash secret weapons from World War II.
Interesting, and all of this got me thinking, what possible weapons, vehicles and gadgets could DICE add into BF5 that are a little bit out there? However you feel about authenticity, the fact is that DICE have always pushed the envelope, and there are tons of weapons in BF1 that never saw the light of day in the real war. Hell, in Battlefield 4 there's a railgun and hover tanks. I'm all for seeing some out there weaponry and vehicles if it makes the game fun. So I spent the last couple of days researching online to find out what the wackiest technology they used in World War II was. First up though, let's just quickly look back at that 1942 DLC called Secret Weapons of World War II. It had jetpacks. Yes, there was a pickup item in the game that allowed you to jetpack around. Well, it was more like floating around. You could shoot while in the air, but it was pretty easily blown up to combat that. So could we realistically see something like that return in BF5? Honestly, I don't think so. I'm not sure how well it would go down. It was a little bit of fun though in the BF 1942 DLC, and I bet that when that game launched, no one thought that eventually there'd be a jetpack in the game. Even still, I think it's very unlikely to be in BF5. I just can't see it happening, but DICE, please prove me wrong. Speaking of flying though, check this out. One of the first things that I found, flying tanks. Bear with me a second. I made that sound quite normal, but during the war, a lot of the big players experimented with attaching glider wings to tanks and then using bombers to tow them into battle areas. Apparently a lot of the test flights were successful, but the tanks themselves were dropped without the crew, which left them vulnerable for a very long time on the ground before the crew met up with them. For the most part, gliding tanks didn't really work, but the research done at the time led to airdropped tanks that we do see today. I don't really think this could make an appearance in Battlefield 5, but flying tanks was too cool not to mention. But then again, this game does have towing in it, so at some point will airplanes be able to pick up tanks? We'll see. If you remember in the original BF Vietnam, helicopters could actually airlift vehicles, so maybe, I'm just saying. But let's come back down to earth for a second. You may have heard of the Sturmgewehr 44 or STG 44 for short. It's a German selective fire rifle developed during the Second World War. Very iconic and widely respected as the first proper assault rifle. It's also known as the MP33 or the MP44. The MP33 and 44 being different designations for what's basically the same rifle with minor updates. And by all accounts, it's also the rifle that the iconic AK-47 is based on. It came very late in the war, and while it did see action, it was too late to make a large impact. That being said, when it did arrive, it had some crazy attachments. Check this out, this is real, okay? One attachment in particular was the Zielgerät 1229 infrared vision sight, which was codenamed Vampire. It was designed to help infantry and snipers shoot at night time. It weighed a whopping 5 pounds, but also had to be connected to a 30-pound battery pack to power the flashlight that the soldier would have strapped to his back. Now that's a lot of weight to be carrying around on your gun just to be able to see at night time. How cool does this thing look though? I could definitely see it appearing in BF5. Soldiers who used it were referred to as night hunters, and maybe down the line, if BF5 has night maps, this could be an attachment. It would of course have very limited use though in daytime maps, it just wouldn't work. Very cool nonetheless though. Staying with the STG for a second though, and something even stranger, what if I told you that in World War II, Germany experimented with rifles that were able to shoot around corners? You'd probably think I was mad, but take a look at this. This is the Krummlauf curved barrel attachment. Germany was the first to attempt it, and the engineers came up with versions from 30 degrees to 90-degree bends. Their purpose was to shoot round corners. The barrels did have a very short lifespan though. The 30-degree version could only last around 300 rounds, and even the 45-degree version could only muster around 160 before they failed. As you can imagine, the barrels were under a lot of stress. I think this looks absolutely bonkers, and let's be honest, probably pretty useless in an FPS game, but come on, if they do a Secret Weapons of World War II DLC for BF5, they've got to put something like this in the game. Maybe you could shoot round corners with the STG, but it would just be incredibly inaccurate. We'll see, it was a real thing. Would it work in the game though? I'm not sure. This next one on the other hand, I could definitely see this being a gadget in the game. It's called the Goliath Tracked Mine. Think of it like a little remote control car but with a bomb attached to it, you know, standard stuff. The Allies referred to them as beetle tanks, but these German remote-controlled bombs could clear out bunkers, destroy tanks, or just disrupt infantry. They could actually carry up to 100 kilograms of explosives and reach a top speed of around 6 miles per hour. Here's the funny part though, they were controlled by a joystick box which was connected by 2,000 feet of cable. So all the Allies needed to do to render the Goliath utterly useless was to just cut the wire. Almost 5,000 of these were made, including a larger version that could carry more explosives, but they were slow, hard to control, and payloads were just too small. They were very ahead of their time though, if you really think about it. Now when it comes to gameplay, I think you could easily have a small remote control item like this without the need for a virtual wire. I think a gadget as crazy as this would definitely be added a long time down the line, because I can already see people comparing it to the RC car from COD Black Ops, but this was something that existed in part in the war, so it wouldn't be entirely out of the question. Now World War II typically isn't known for helicopters, fighters, bombers, yep, but not helicopters. What if I told you though that there was in fact a kind of a helicopter used during the Second World War, even if it was a rarity? Introducing the Flettner FL282. It was produced by Anton Flettner of Germany. To put this into context, around 30 prototypes and 15 pre-production models were built before 1,000 were ordered in 1944. Allied bombing runs disrupted production though, and with the factory forced to relocate, it meant that by 1945 only 24 of these were made. A few of them had closed plexiglass cockpits, but most were open. Only around 50 pilots were trained to fly them. 3 of them survived the war though. One of them is apparently at the Midland Air Museum in Coventry, England, and another held by the US Air Force Museum. The machine was initially intended for reconnaissance and for ferrying items between ships, but as the war progressed, the Germans considered converting the FL-282 for battlefield use. And I think that this is a vehicle we could definitely see added into BF5, maybe in an endgame DLC. Helicopters have always been a pivotal aspect of battlefield games, whether that's attack or transport. But I think if something like this was to be added as an offensive attack chopper, then certainly some liberties would have to be taken. But you have to admit, it's pretty cool, and I'd love to see this in the game. Speaking of more cool experimental aircraft, this is the Whorton Ho2. This plane, or jet really, as it was the first pure flying wing plane to be powered by a jet engine, was way ahead of its time. It also only flew in the dying days of the war, and well, the only powered example of the plane crashed. Not that effective, it seems. The flying wing design isn't an everyday sight because it's incredibly hard to make it work. The tail on a plane helps keep the aircraft stable and stops the yaw from side to side. Get rid of that and the plane is a lot harder to control. I remember reading a BBC article a few years ago explaining how NASA was still doing research on this plane, trying to work out how the engineers overcame the considerable aerodynamic challenges that should have made it unflyable. Like I said, it was definitely ahead of its time, and it still crashed. If you could make it work though, it would make the plane harder to spot on radar, partially because it had no tail fins that would bounce back radar waves, and also the overall plane design meant that it had as little drag as possible. Now some say because it never saw combat it shouldn't be included, but I think we could see something like this added with a DLC down the line, much like the Secret Weapons of World War II DLC for 1942, maybe even a prototype phase of Tides of War. I think that would be excellent. Okay, enough about planes. Let's talk about the real stuff. Vortex cannons. You know, powerful cannons that can fire off a tornado-like donut of air into the sky. Pretty standard stuff, right? Well, this thing was designed and built by the Austrian Dr. Zimmer Meyer, and it was essentially a long barrel sunk into the ground. It was then filled with dust, coal, and a slow-burning explosive with the purpose of creating an artificial tornado that could blow planes out of the sky. The prototype tests seem to prove the effectiveness of the weapon in ideal circumstances, but in practice, it was a lot less lethal than expected. It was very difficult to aim and wasn't really that effective at all. It was sadly never used in combat. A stationary weapon in BF5 though? Perhaps. So in conclusion, really, this is just a small sample of the crazy amount of wacky weapon ideas, concepts, prototypes, and just downright madness and ingenuity from World War II. The technology just changed and advanced at such a rapid rate. Death ray cannons, bouncing bombs, stun rays, 1,000-ton tanks that were never built, even anti-tank dogs. Well, that's a sad story. There's a lot of potential to tap into, and I know concept and prototype ideas is not everyone's cup of tea, but remember that a lot of weapons from many Battlefield games that we love never saw actual combat. That doesn't make the games any less fun though. Compared to World War I, there's just an abundance of source material for DICE to get stuck into here, and I'd love to hear stories about any crazy vehicles or weapons that you guys have come across down in the comments below. And that's all for today folks, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, give me a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.